As the release date for Little Nightmares 3 draws ever closer, one area in particular has been receiving a lot of attention: the Carnevale. A great deal of new footage was shown during the official showcase in July, and September saw the release of a novel set entirely within this location, The Lonely Ones. This all-new story is a fascinating addition to the lore of Little Nightmares that not only expands our understanding of the Carnevale, but also gives us a glimpse into the deeper mysteries of Nowhere, and so I wanted to take some time and explore these secrets and connections in a dedicated video. Needless to say, full spoilers for The Lonely Ones ahead, as well as significant spoilers for the Sounds of Nightmares podcast and Little Nightmares 2. If you're at all interested in reading the book yourself, then I would definitely recommend doing that first, but if not, I'll be kicking things off with a very brief synopsis of the story to hopefully catch you up to speed before diving into the details. The story begins abruptly as a young girl jolts awake, sopping wet and gasping for air. She finds herself in a dark, narrow space, clutching a broken pocket watch in her left hand, but unable to recall why it's important. This is Ruse. Or at least, that is what she chooses to call herself based on her limited memory. She finds herself in the company of two other children, a boy she calls Feast and a girl she calls Mim, both of whom appear to be from different time periods than her own, the former wearing a red kerchief over his face and the latter wearing a length of dangling rope around her neck. Together, these three children wander the Carnevale in search of a way out, a journey that takes them through 6 different locations as shown on screen. After slipping from the grasp of giant, misshapen residents at the Carousel, who are known collectively as the Herd, they make their way into a paper hedge maze, prowled by a giant black centipede and shortly set ablaze by a fallen tent. They escape into the backstage area of a theater, where we are introduced to the antagonist of the story. The Performer, a mime with wrinkled skin that is dressed in black and white with a face painted to match. He catches Mim and places her under a spell, forcing her to copy his motions, and after exiting to the stage through a door painted on the wall, he uses her as a prop while performing to a packed audience of the corpulent carnival goers. Though Ruse is captivated by his act at first, Feast is able to pull her out of the trance, and she manages to stop the show by turning off the spotlights. They leave the theater to find it raining outside, and after climbing part of the roller coaster track in order to get a better view, are shocked to find that the Carnevale is not on the ground, but instead floating high up in the clouds. Just then, the rain stops and the rides resume operation. They climb into the empty rear seat of one of the carts, riding the full length of the coaster until it enters a narrow tunnel, where the residents in the other 4 carts are shortened a bit and unceremoniously dumped out. Now feeling a bit disoriented, the 3 children make their way into an arcade building filled with game booths that are run by a team of wooden puppets. As you might expect, the puppets chase after them immediately, and in the chaos the Performer appears once more, retaking control of Mim and causing Feast to be captured by the puppets and tossed into a giant ball pit. Ruse jumps in after him to find that not only is the pit impossibly deep, but something very large is moving around in it as well. Quite possibly the same creature we've seen elsewhere in piles of shoes and other trash. Fortunately, she succeeds in rescuing Feast from whatever it is, and as they rush out of the arcade in pursuit of Mim, the two find themselves at a loading dock, crisscrossed with conveyor belts and stacked high with crates. Some of these crates had been pushed together into a makeshift stage, and atop them stands Mim, now wearing the same face paint as the Performer and once again forced to copy his routine, this time to an audience of crows. While Feast tries in vain to pull Mim out of it, Ruse discovers another one of the Performer's strange door paintings on a crate and crawls through it into his lair, a room made almost entirely out of mirrors with a gramophone sitting on a table at one end. Feast's voice echoes through it, and by cranking the volume extremely high, Ruse shatters the room into countless pieces. Now severely weakened, the Performer crawls out after the children, but this is the end of the line. Quite literally, in fact, for all of them are now on a moving conveyor belt that extends off the deck and into the open sky. Ruse and Feast break the spell on Mim by holding her in a tight embrace, and when she bows to the Performer, he is forced to bow back. His beret falls onto the belt, and only moments later the strange man falls off the end and into the air, uttering a single anguished cry. With no time to waste, the 3 children each grab hold of the Performer's beret, stretching it out impossibly wide. They jump out into the sky and, using the hat as a parachute, float as if weightless into an uncertain future. There is quite a lot to unpack in this relatively short story, but let's start with the true nature of the Carnevale itself. Though it was hinted at some time ago in Chapter 4 of the Sounds of Nightmares podcast, we now have concrete evidence that the carnival is set atop a massive airship, floating through the clouds as herds of insatiable residents participate in its many attractions. There are subtle hints that it wasn't always like this, though. After escaping the hedge maze, the children find themselves in a narrow passageway with walls of packed dirt, and later a dirt floor as well. Why would the design of an airship include a large amount of dirt? Furthermore, elsewhere Ruse notes the presence of empty caravans with cracked and missing wheels, their rotten walls falling apart, and paint faded to the color of storm clouds. Clearly, they have not been used in some time, which makes sense. Their purpose may have been to pack up and transport the carnival to new locations, but this is no longer possible. Considering these details, I suspect that the carnival may have originally been set on the ground somewhere and was later scooped up onto this airship, dirt, caravans, and all. As for how such a massive structure is held aloft, though, this remains a mystery. Judging by the design of a hot air balloon that is seen carrying cargo and passengers to and from the structure, it could be using massive balloons and propellers itself, but even that feels like a stretch. It just doesn't feel possible for an airship to work like this. Except this is no ordinary ship. Throughout the course of the story, there are 3 hints that the carnival is in fact alive, an entity of flesh and eyes similar to the signal tower and shopping mall, which might explain how it is seemingly able to defy the laws of physics. First, we learn that behind the glass walls of the performer's mirror chamber lurks a seeking eye. Second, the theater schedule seems to be managed by a hushed, distorted voice emanating from speakers on the walls. It tells the performer when to report to the stage for a show, and then tells the audience to exit when the show is over. This is highly reminiscent of the voice that speaks to Noon over the intercom system of the shopping mall, ultimately guiding her to a theater. A theater that also just so happens to have a red carpeted lobby, I might add. Third, and perhaps most importantly, are the backstage paintings. These large canvas murals are used as backdrops for the performers' various routines, and it is immediately clear that something isn't quite right about them. Upon seeing a canvas depicting a yellow house, Ruse is immediately drawn into a vision of a different house from her memory, its features shifting to match the details in her mind. As she moves toward it, Feast pulls her back, and when Ruse looks down at the floor beneath them, she observes a number of empty paint cans lying about, one of them on its side and spilling a dark, viscous liquid. This perfectly matches the description of the dark liquid that begins to leak out of the shopping mall after Noon runs from the projector booth, as well as the inky fluid that can be seen leaking out of the maw in some places. What if the substance used for these canvas paintings isn't really paint at all, but instead a strange and powerful liquid produced by the masses of flesh? This would explain why the paintings have supernatural properties that go even beyond Ruse's vision. The performer travels around the carnival by painting doors on hard surfaces, and when Ruse touches one of them, her palms begin to itch and tingle. Later, the performer is somehow able to pull a knife from the mural behind him and use it during his routine. These similarities between the carnival and shopping mall are conspicuous, but there is one very big difference between the two. While the latter is empty, utterly devoid of any residents, the carnival is absolutely packed with them. They wander the fairgrounds as a herd, grazing on its various attractions until finally reaching the roller coaster, which functions as a slaughterhouse in disguise. At the end of the ride, the carts enter a dark tunnel, carrying their riders straight into razor-sharp blades that free them of their heads and subsequently dump the bodies into a storage area. Some of this meat is then fed to the rest of the herd as snacks, if the strange gray cubes sizzling on the theater grill are anything to go by, but the vast majority is carefully wrapped in butcher paper, tied up with rope, and packed up in large crates that are shipped out from the docks on the very same balloons that, presumably, would have brought these residents in the first place. Such is the cycle of the carnival, which raises an important question. Where is this herd coming from? According to Ruse, they have muscular arms but legs that are short and thin. Almost as if they spent their lives suspended in harnesses, using their arms for hard manual labor and barely needing to use their legs at all. I'm wondering if the carnival serves as a kind of send-off or reward for workers at the candy factory, an idea that might be supported by this map shown in the most recent trailer. A number of chalk figures can be seen hastily drawn over the land masses, and 2 of them appear to be riding in some kind of contraption. Harnesses, maybe? The last thing I want to point out about the carnival itself is that it seems to be traveling over an ocean, for Ruse describes the distant horizon as a place where sky touches sea. What's more, she notes the absence of any stars in the otherwise clear sky. Both of these details support my theory outlined in the Cosmology of Nowhere. Namely, that this realm is a vast ocean dotted with islands, and the eldritch creatures of flesh and eyes are themselves the stars of this great cosmic canvas. On that watery note, let's move on. It's time to talk about Ruse and her experience crossing the threshold. Like Noon, Ruse is from the counties, and their stories share some common themes. When she was very young, Ruse's parents became wealthy and important. So important, in fact, that they no longer had time for her. They began to see their daughter as nothing more than a burden on their time and energy, buying her lots of toys and other material possessions to keep her occupied. But this could only go so far, and before long, Ruse began to crave companionship and attention, likely begging her parents for it as only a child can. But this just made things worse. Her parents grew angry when she displayed such emotion, considering it weakness. They would stop talking to her and made a point of leaving her behind at the house for long stretches of time, including overnight on multiple occasions. This would be pretty cold in any circumstances, but was even more so because, depending on how we interpret Ruse's ominous mention of kids being lured by an ice cream truck, there may have been a string of kidnappings occurring in the area, making it a very unsafe place for children. The only bright spot in her life was Nanny, a gentle old woman who loved all the kids in the neighborhood, but what little time and attention she was able to spend on Ruse directly just wasn't enough. The girl felt she had nothing left to lose, and so, one night just past 1:25 a.m., and at the bidding of a dark figure in the shadows that can only be the ferryman, she crossed the threshold into nowhere by jumping into Nanny's pool, the water becoming dark and bitter as a portal to the other world opened within it. This is very interesting since it challenges our previous understanding of how children are pulled into nowhere that is based on the Sounds of Nightmares podcast. As you'll no doubt recall, Noon crosses over the threshold directly through a dream, sinking deeply into the dark mist and taking the ferryman's hand as he ushers her through a shifting door, knowing full well what awaited her on the other side. In contrast, Ruse doesn't seem to have any idea what nowhere is or how she got there, remaining confused even when her memories begin to return. But when you stop to think about it, how could she? Ruse didn't have someone like Otto to explain things like mutual dreaming or the quiddity of consciousness. She could rely only on herself and her own emotions that were likely being manipulated by a tiny ocular tumor in her brain. On 2 separate occasions, Ruse describes feeling an itching sensation on the back of her head, just like Noon did in Chapter 2 of the podcast, each time giving her the impression that she is being watched. One way or another, Nowhere was working to claim her, to convince her that life would be better in the darkness, and eventually it succeeded. But how and why did she cross through a pool instead of a dream? I have several thoughts about this. First, Otto's professor believed that entering the quiddity of consciousness required finding a gateway, places hidden among our world, and it could be that this pool just so happens to be one of these places. Alternatively, perhaps the threshold is able to bridge with any body of water within our world given the right conditions, and this is actually the more common way for children to cross. Noon was the outlier, connected as she was to Otto's dream apparatus that suspended her at the hypnagogic threshold, both asleep and awake at the same time. Whatever the case may be, any child who is willing to leap into a cold, black pool in the dead of night like this is one who is clearly willing to leave their world behind and sink into nowhere, and that is exactly what Ruse did. So desperately did she wish to find a place where she didn't feel alone or confused or invisible that it drowned out her logical fear, and in her memory of this event, she recalls a very interesting detail. 2 bodies floating on the surface of the pool, getting smaller and smaller as the water pulls her ever deeper, until Ruse finally wakes up sopping wet in a room that just so happens to hold 2 other bodies, Feast and Mim. I don't think this is a coincidence, and I don't think those bodies in the pool were physically there. Rather, I believe Ruse was seeing a vision of sorts, a representation of Feast and Mim crossing the threshold at the same time as her, headed for the same place, and this interpretation is further supported by another of Ruse's memories. While preparing to jump, she dipped a toe into the water and watched ripples spread across the pool, scattering stars and bodies. Obviously, a few tiny ripples wouldn't have any noticeable effect on a physical body, but if they were nothing more than vague shadows or impressions of bodies on the water, then this description would make sense. It also isn't unprecedented for children to cross paths at the threshold. This happened to Noon as well, for at the beginning of the shopping mall dream she says, "In the dark, a hand let go of mine." At any rate, it is certainly no coincidence that Ruse ended up with 2 other children in the carousel, but to explain why, we first need to turn our attention to the performer. The performer is immediately distinct from the shambling, mindless herd, far more intelligent and filled with both curiosity and intent. He also wields two great powers. First, the ability to captivate all those who watch his act, commanding their complete attention. And second, the ability to manipulate sound in a wide area, rendering the space completely silent to everyone but himself and those in his act. When you stop to think about it, this effect isn't all too different from the Thin Man's control over time. Each ability warps the area around its caster, increasing their power over others and making it easier to catch any stray children that may have stumbled into their vicinity. Another similarity between these two residents is that both seem to spend a great deal of time in small, rectangular rooms, carefully monitoring their areas of influence. But instead of concrete, the walls and ceiling of the performer's chamber are made entirely of mirrors, creating a kaleidoscope of infinite reflections, and making it possible for him to travel through the door paintings that he conjures throughout the carnival. As for what the performer wants exactly, I think his motive is quite simple: to train other performers, possibly even his own replacement, and the performer chooses Mim. Upon taking a closer look at each of Mim's interactions with the man, a gradual progression becomes apparent. First, at the theater, she is only a prop, a wind-up doll, in the performer's act as he commands the stage, and importantly, Ruse and Feast can both look at her without becoming entranced. Next, at the arcade, she becomes an extension of him, duplicating his routine to an audience of puppets while the performer moves within the shadows. In this instance, Feast does become caught in the spell by looking at her. Next, on the dock, she becomes an even more distant extension of him, duplicating his routine to an audience of riveted crows while the performer himself returns to the mirror chamber. Not only are Ruse and Feast unable to look at Mim now, but the power in her performance prevents them from even getting close to her. Finally, she takes full control of the act herself on the conveyor belt, commanding even the performer. The tears running down her cheeks leave dark black streaks down the man's face as though his eyes were melting, revealing a dark void within, and when she bows, he must bow back, leading to his demise. It is through this gradual process of Mim becoming a performer that the central conflict of the story is made apparent. Not children versus residents, but children versus the darkness. There are two possible paths every child can take here, each one leading to a predetermined outcome, and both are represented in the trio. Mim is drawn to the darkness, growing stronger. Feast resists the darkness, growing weaker. And Ruse remains undecided, the observer. At least for now. Let's start with Mim. At first, the girl is extremely timid, terrified to be part of the performer's act, but after they escape, she can't stop looking back. Ruse assumes it to be fear, but Mim isn't acting like herself either. She is braver, leading the way into the arcade, where she is easily caught once again. Perhaps wanting to be. Later, after the performer is defeated, Ruse notices that Mim's face paint won't come off and that she seems like a new person, standing straight, no longer shy, and a strange flash of emotion passes over her eyes that makes Ruse begin to feel suspicious. Finally, as the three children descend below the carnival using their makeshift parachute, Ruse observes that Mim's eyes are glassily fixed on the ship above as if she has left behind something important up there: her innocence. She is drawn to the darkness, wanting more and more of it now that she has experienced its power for herself, which is precisely what happened to Six in Little Nightmares 2. Remember, it is only after being caught in the Thin Man's spell and trapped in the signal tower that Six develops her hunger, haunted by her own shadow. Like Six, Mim had tasted the power that lay in nowhere and is now set on the path to being warped forevermore by its dark influence, as hinted at on the back cover of the book. In contrast, Feast is immediately kind and helpful, willing to take risks and take the lead for his companions, trusting them right from the start. He proves to be less susceptible to outside influences like the canvas paintings or the performer's act, pulling Ruse away from both of them. And all the while his condition, admittedly quite dire to begin with, gets worse. He is starving, wasting away before their eyes. On the roller coaster tracks, Ruse observes that his usually sharp eyes had become distant and unfocused, and at the docks she notes that he urgently needs food and rest. Two things he is not likely to get much of in this world. For the sake of illustrating this dichotomy of choice, it makes a lot of sense why the story follows three children instead of just one, but I think something else is going on here too. Repeatedly, Ruse wonders what brought them all together and why, and she can't shake the feeling that invisible ties are binding them together in this place. Which begs the question, why? Why would Nowhere allow 3 children to be placed together in exactly the same location, where they would be capable of helping each other past the dangers of this twisted world? While it's impossible to say for certain, since we still don't know for sure what the Eyes of Nowhere actually want, I believe part of the answer is hinted at in the arcade. The very first booth found within is a traditional ring toss, in which the player must throw small blue rings over the necks of glass bottles. However, as is the case with many Carnival games, it can be very easily rigged. Ruse recalls a vague memory of her father explaining the trick at a fair in the counties. Some of the bottles already have rings on them to make players think it's easy to succeed, but the bottles are set up to hide that they're actually larger than the rings that are given to throw, making it impossible to win no matter how accurate your aim is. Perhaps in this case, the children themselves are the blue rings, giving each other hope that they can endure, they can survive, and maybe, just maybe, they can someday escape. It is only by working together that the trio are able to overcome the herd, the centipede, the puppets, and the performer, after all, emerging victorious on the other side. But in the end, where do these efforts lead? To the birth of a new cycle, as the dark power held within one human vessel is transferred to another, just as the Eyes wanted all along. The cycles must continue. They need you to play the game, and so they need you to think you can win. And with that, we come to the end of this video, a deep dive into the Lonely Ones novel. Though truth be told, I'm still leaving quite a bit on the table here. You may have noticed that I neglected to mention the appearance of Lo's Raven mask, the ceramic statues filled with dark mist, or the obvious connections to the puppeteer from Chapter 6 of the podcast and how she is almost certainly making costumes for those who perform at the carnival, but I wanted to keep this video at a reasonable length, and I also figured that we would be learning a whole lot more about some of these details soon in Little Nightmares 3. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, then be sure to hit the like button, share your own thoughts and theories in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for plenty more Little Nightmares content in the months ahead. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.